All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And today you are getting my takeaways from the Rams win over the Bengals in the big game, as well as our first mock draft Monday of the offseason, where we talk about the Falcons taking a pass catcher at the top of the 2022 NFL draft.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans. And, of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And, of course, I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify, and, of course, free and available on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel and give us a like when you do. So today we're talking about the sort of Super Bowl takeaways, and then we'll get into our mock draft Monday. As far as Super Bowl takeaways, they're not particularly profound. I'm not necessarily a big believer in doing what a lot of people do, which is look at the team that won the Super Bowl and be like, that's how you got to build it. You got to copy what they did and how they built it or whatever the case may be. As far as sort of the Rams building it the right way, like my biggest takeaways are twofold from the front office standpoint. Like Les Snead was able to do the thing that Dimitrov was not able to do, which is make the moves to get the Rams over the hump after they got, beat in the Super Bowl a couple of years ago, and they were able to sort of reload, reset, and get back and win it this year. And of course, I'm sure Thomas Dimitrov would love to sort of go back and redo some moves that they made, the Falcons made from like that 2010 through 2013 and certainly 2014 era, where they were not able to successfully get over the hump and ultimately win a Super Bowl for the Falcons then. And then my other takeaway from a coaching standpoint is just like Sean McVay seems to be able to overcome all the coaching turnover and still get the most out of his football team year after year for the most part. And certainly we're able to do that. This game, I looked it up, like when you look at the 20 assistants that were made up of that McVay staff when he first arrived in LA back in 2017, I think only two guys are still left. The wide receivers coach and the secondary coach are still there from that group. So they've been able to lose a bunch of coaches and people part of the front office, the Detroit Lions general managers from that front office, and be able to still maintain a relative high degree of success. But from the game itself, nothing super profound. I was impressed with the Bengals. I think you can make the argument that they outplayed the Rams for most of this game. I thought the Bengals did a really great job not losing the battle along the line of scrimmage for the first half of the game. We saw the Rams pass rush kind of start to assert itself in the second half of the game. They seemed to make some adjustments to be able to get some one-on-ones, and Von Miller and Aaron Donald, as well as others, were able to assert themselves a little bit more starting in that third quarter, where we thought the Bengals offensive line would be sort of being teed off all game long, and that was not the case until the second half of the game. But my biggest takeaway was probably the officiating. If I'm being completely honest, and longtime listeners know I'm not a big believer in blaming the officiating for the outcome of a game. I'm not going to do that here, but if I'm a Bengals fan, I would be pretty upset right now because this game was kind of called a certain way for like 58 minutes. There was like 4 penalties in the first 58 minutes of the game, and then there were like 3 consecutive penalties on that Rams sort of game-winning drive at the end. And they seem to be calling everything after not calling anything the entire game. And certainly, while I wouldn't sit here and be like, we can probably rehash, what was a missed call or whatever the case may be, but I wouldn't sit here and be like, oh, they missed this call and that cost us the game or anything like that. But it's just like you want to have an even game. And we've seen the officiating really kind of rear its ugly head throughout the postseason for and against teams. And, the Bengals got a gift of a call in an earlier playoff game, and it seemed like they got a couple of calls against them in this game. So you win some, you lose some sort of thing. But like you just kind of wish that the officiating was not going to be a talking point at the end of these games as they have been throughout, this postseason and throughout the last couple of seasons. So that was kind of my main takeaway from this game. But obviously, if you've been listening to the podcast or watching the podcast, you've known for a long time that I've been, crowing about how, back on February 8th of 2021, I put in a bet for the Rams to win the Super Bowl. So who I was rooting for, trying to make a little bit of money, a little bit of scratch here, for this game. And I was successfully able to do that. So I was definitely rooting for the Rams. And if you were worried about, oh no, Aaron, he called his shot a year ago and it's going to only make him more arrogant, you got another thing coming, because I'm going to, I got people out there being like, Aaron, you got to be more humble on the podcast. And I'm like, oh no, my friend, if you thought my ego was going to shrink now, then by all means, you are in for a rude awakening. Last takeaway before we move on to Mock Draft Monday is the halftime show was great. I do have some notes, though. I probably would have flipped the order of Kendrick and Eminem. I would have liked to seen sort of, since Kendrick is more the future of hip hop than the past, to have the future at the end of the show, closer to the end of the show. But I get what it is. But, great halftime show, one of the best they've ever done, if not the best that they've ever done. So that was great to see. And that was probably the highlight of the evening, to be honest with you. But a great game overall. Coop, my hat's out for the Bengals. Tough loss, obviously. If you guys want to get more profound insights into the ins and outs of this game, of course, Locked On Bengals, Locked On Rams, Locked On NFL, Peacock and Williamson are going to be some of the places that you can go. Of course, you can find all of those shows on a variety of podcast platforms as well as on YouTube. But we're going to turn our attention now to Mock Draft Monday, the first of 11 that we plan to do this offseason. Every Monday until the draft, we will have a Mock Draft Monday, breaking down a new mock draft. And today we're going to be looking at Lance Zierlein's mock draft from this past Wednesday, where he had the Falcons taking Arkansas wide receiver Treylon Burks. And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, guys, it's a new year, and that means a lot of people, have already broken their New Year's resolutions. I know I've broken my New Year's resolution. And if you were trying to eat healthier and get fit, a way that you could have maintained your New Year's resolution, probably better if you've already broken it, or if you haven't broken it but you're holding on to dear life, Built Bar is the way to go in order to improve your ability to eat healthier and stay fit, because eating healthy can be hard. I know for me, when I've done past diet regimens, you get bored of eating the same old thing over and over again. And Built Bars bring a whole lot of variety with a variety of different flavors. Again, they have the protein bars that taste like a candy bar. They're healthy for you. They taste good. They're good for you. They're low in sugar, calories, and carbs, high in protein and fiber. You can get them in a variety of flavors like coconut brownie chunk, white chocolate cookies and cream, banana cream puff bar, coconut almond peanut butter brownie, and so much more. All you got to do is head over to built.com. And when you do, use the promo code LOCK15 and you'll get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. So our first Mock Draft Monday, we are looking at Lance Zierlein of NFL.com's Wednesday mock from this past Wednesday, where he had the Falcons taking Arkansas wide receiver Treylon Burks with the number 8 overall draft selection. And we talked about Treylon Burks on a recent, I think, Q&A back in late January, where a listener submitted a question where he basically said, I like Treylon Burks for the Falcons at 8. What are your thoughts on Treylon Burks? In my opinion, it hasn't really changed all that much on the idea of the Falcons taking Treylon Burks. I wasn't necessarily keen on that idea then. And the main reason why, because if I'm going to use a top 10 pick on a wide receiver, and we know that you don't necessarily need to use high picks on wide receivers, at least top 10 picks, to get quality players. We saw that in the Super Bowl, players like T. Higgins, a second-round pick, players like Cooper Kupp, a third-round pick, Robert Woods, who wasn't in the Super Bowl, but I think was also a third-round pick several years ago, or second-round pick, I think, several years ago. You can get quality receivers later in the draft. And so if you want to use a top 10 pick on a wide receiver, it better be a Jamar Chase. It better be a Julio Jones type of player. And I don't think Treylon Burks is that type of player. Now, part of the reason why I said that is because I didn't know Treylon Burks had that sort of top end speed that you typically want in that, dude type of wide receiver that you're taking in top 10, like Julio and like Jamar Chase are. I've seen some recent information that seems that I probably underestimated Treylon Burks' speed. I've seen some GPS tracking data that seems to suggest that he, instead of running in the 4.5s, which is what I estimated him to do based off of watching him on film, that he may run into 4.4s and may even break into the 4.3s, which I think I said on that episode. He needs to run at least a 4.39 before I even really give him serious consideration for the top 10 pick. So he may wind up doing that and run like a 4.36 or something like that. So I misestimated that. And the main reason why is because watching him on film, like I didn't see a guy that was really good at creating vertical separation. Like there was a big play he had against Texas A&M where he had to push off in order to create that vertical separation to get down the field and get past the defender. But you do see that speed, particularly after the catch. There's a number of plays that you can see him really, run away from people once he gets the ball into his hands. And that's really where Burks sort of excels, after the catch. He's a guy that's going to get a lot of comps compared to AJ Brown, and that makes a ton of sense. According to PFF, he spent over 70% of his snaps in the slot this past year. AJ Brown was almost exclusively a slot receiver in his final year at Ole Miss. Burks can run the digs, the crossers, the fades that we've seen AJ Brown run to a high degree in Arthur Smith's offense in Tennessee. And we know that Arthur Smith's offense basically only asks his wide receivers to run a handful of routes, and those are mainly it. And Burks can definitely do those things. So in a previous ranking I put on Twitter, I think I had Burks at like 5 on my wide receiver rankings. I'll probably, because I underestimated his speed, probably will knock him up to top 3. I don't know if I'm going to have him leapfrog guys like Jamison Williams out of Alabama or Drake London out of USC on my personal rankings. I think Burks certainly fits the profile as an ex-wide receiver, similar to Drake London. I personally like London a little bit more. I think he's a better blocker. I think he has better hands, although he did drop a number of passes this past year. I think London's probably a little bit more polished as a route runner, does a little bit better job getting separation on some of those intermediate routes, but Burks probably has some speed in terms of just pure speed, in terms of pure size and physicality in that regard. And that's what you're looking for. Then Burks definitely checks that box. But, I'm not necessarily keen on the idea of taking a wide receiver in the top 10. And the truth is, as we unpack 10 more of these mock draft Mondays, there's probably not going to be too many players that are going to be projected to the Falcons at that 8th overall selection that I'm going to be super high on. So I'm just going to give you guys a heads up right now that we may do a bunch of these, and I'll be like, he's a good player. I like him as a player, but I don't love him for the Falcons at that 8th overall selection. And part of that is due to, I think, this specific draft class being somewhat of a down year. And part of that is due to, I think, the Falcons are at a point in their rebuilding phase where it's hard for me to fall in love with one prospect in the first round. And I will get into exactly what I mean by that as we wrap up today's Mock Draft Monday. But guys, in addition to Locked On Rams and Locked On Bengals and all those shows on the NFL side of the podcast, of course, if you want to check out the local shows here in the Georgia, Atlanta area, of course, there's Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, and Locked On Hawks that you can find free and available on all the same podcast platforms, including Locked On Braves and Locked On Bulldogs here on YouTube. So as we continue today's episode, we know that football season is now over with the last game, and so you won't be able to bet on football like I was able to do, but I'm sure you can head on over to betonline.net right now and find those future props for next year's Super Bowl winner. And then by all means, make sure you put in a bet there so that you can be as arrogant as I am going to be for the next, 8 or 9 months by, crowing about that Super Bowl pick. And of course, BetOnline is not just great for picking next year's Super Bowl winner, but you can bet right now on the basketball season, which is in full swing with pro and college hoops. And it's not just basketball, it's hockey, it's boxing, it's UFC. You can even play your favorite Vegas casino games. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports and game wagering action. So head to the website today at betonline.net. Use your mobile device to sign up, and you can get all the best odds, totals, and player props and what more in futures bets. So head on over to BetOnline, where the game starts. So as I said, it's going to be hard for me this offseason to get excited about too many of these mock drafts, we may get 11 deep, and I'm lukewarm on all 11 of the possible selections for the Falcons pick. And you'll be like, Aaron, you don't like anybody in this draft class. And it's not that I don't like these players. I think there are plenty of these guys that, when we have the value of hindsight, 3 to 5 years from now, that will turn into good players and whatnot. It's not that I don't think any of these guys are good. It's just hard for me to get excited about, this Falcons pick, because I think a number of these players, including a player, argue like Treylon Burks. Like, if you put him in last year's draft class, is he getting drafted ahead of Rashad Bateman, who was like the 23rd overall pick, or whatever the case may be? Is he a top 10 pick last year? And I think that's probably true of a lot of players that are going to be mocked to the Falcons over the next, 2.5 months at pick number 8. Like, are these guys really top 10 picks in most years, or would they have been, if they were in last year's draft class or the previous year's draft class, would they have been picked, 10, 15 spots later, or whatever the case may be? And I do wonder about that, because I think that's a testament to how down, or arguably down, this draft class is. And so it's hard for me to get excited about guys that aren't necessarily popping as, oh, that's a guy that's a top 10 pick each and every year. And we're going to use a top 10 pick, and that's going to raise expectations for that player. But a lot of it is like the Falcons are at a point where, we're in this, semi rebuilding phase. Again, I guess we'll see how much of a rebuild the Falcons are in, but it's hard for me to get excited about one draft pick. I see so many other people build up, particularly the first round pick, to be the end all be all of the offseason, as if this is the pinnacle of what this team. And it's like, I just look at it as like, hey, get a good player. It's one out of potentially a dozen moves that the Falcons are going to have to make this offseason and or next offseason to get better as a football team. And while this may be arguably the most important move of those dozen moves, it's just one. You still got to hit. You can nail this pick, but if you don't get the other 11 right, or you only get 3 out of another 11 right, then how much does it really move the needle? And just to use examples, like, let's say we draft a wide receiver, and we've seen the Falcons try to have this 1-2 punch in terms of pass catchers for the last decade, starting with Thomas Dimitroff, with Julio and Roddy White, and trading it all for Julio in that 2011 draft. But we never saw those guys outside of the 2012 season really have two peak consecutive, or two simultaneous, peak seasons. In that, and then several years later, we bring in Calvin Ridley, and then you don't really get him and Julio on the same page. Like, you got half a year of Calvin Ridley playing at a high level in 2018. You got most of a year in 2019, outside of the handful of games that Ridley missed that year. And then 2020, Julio missed half that year. So all in all, you're looking at maybe 32-ish games of peak production from those guys. And then you bring in Kyle Pitts, and you're thinking, oh man, I said this on last year's episode, oh man, we're going to have Kyle Pitts and Calvin Ridley. They're going to finally deliver on this dream that Dimitroff sold us on a decade ago. And guess what? We're about to trade Calvin Ridley. So that dream is dead. And so you're going to bring in Treylon Burks. And I've seen this movie before, where you're going to have this dream of these guys being a 1-2 punch. And maybe that we finally get that after a decade. But again, I've seen this story over and over again. And so it doesn't get me as excited as it would have got me a year ago, or 4 years ago, or 10 years ago, as it does right now. And then you couple that with the fact that, okay, you're going to take another pass catcher, which is fine. Again, but when we did that in 2011, we did that in 2018, we didn't have the same concerns that we have on our offensive line. We didn't have the same concerns on our defense, and we certainly didn't have the same question marks about the future of our quarterback. No one was, some people were, but very few people were questioning Matt Ryan at that time. And now we're sitting here questioning Matt Ryan. Well, I'm sure some of you are like, we shouldn't be questioning Matt Ryan, but this would be a move that clearly is the team trying to prop up what, again, sue me for saying this, be as arrogant in saying certain things now that, I've won a little bit of money. So, I feel like I have carte blanche to say whatever I want, but, this is a move kind of to prop up a declining quarterback at this point in time, and rather than address some of the other issues. So that's part of it, where it's hard for me to get excited about Treylon Burks, even if I thought, he was that dude, even if I thought he was a Jamar Chase type of player, it probably wouldn't get me as excited as it normally would. Let's say the Falcons draft another position, right? They don't go with the pass catcher. Let's say they draft the offensive lineman that, they kind of need, but it's a one pick. It's one starting spot. You fix one out of 3, possibly 4, if you want to throw Jake Matthews in terms of his longevity here, that the Falcons may have to wind up replacing up to 4 of their starting offensive linemen over the next 2 or 3 years. So even if you hit on this draft pick, even if you draft Evan Neal or Charles Cross or Ike Ekwonu, whoever, right? It's 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 problem solved. You still need to solve the other 2 or 3 problems, right? Let's say you go with a defensive player, like a pass rusher, right? And let's say, we talked about before how the Falcons have gone 20 years without hitting on a homegrown pass rusher since Patrick Kearney in 1999. Let's say you draft Patrick Kearney 2.0. Let's say you draft Patrick Kearney 5.0, and this guy is, way better than what Patrick Kearney was. But guess what? We've seen what having one good pass rusher does for you, whether it was Grady Jarrett this past year, whether it was, 6 years of John Abraham, where, you look at Football Outsiders adjusted sack rate, and I mentioned this when we did our edge rusher year-end breakdown. Like, you look at that metric over the last 14 years of Matt Ryan's career, the Falcons have had an adjusted sack rate that wasn't in the bottom 10 or 12 only twice, in 2008 and 2010. 2008 was primarily because Jonathan Abraham, Freudian slip. I always have Jonathan Babineau on the mind, but John Abraham was, sort of single-handedly carrying that pass rush with 16 and a half sacks that season in 2008, and they were 10th in adjusted sack rate on defense. But, we had John Abraham for like 6 years, and that was the only time where the Falcons didn't have like a bottom 10 pass rush, where they had one really great pass rusher. And then you look at the 2017 season, the only other year where they were league average in adjusted sack rate at 16, and that was primarily because they had 6 solid pass rushers in Claiborne and Poe and Jarrett and Tack and Beasley and Brooks Reed. But again, the point is, one great pass rusher, even if you hit on this guy and you get a 1-2 punch with him and Grady Jarrett, and then you wonder, how much longer is Grady Jarrett going to be a Falcon? And then you're back to square one if you wind up moving on from Grady Jarrett with, this offseason or next offseason or whatever the case may be. So again, it's hard for me, even if you do get excited about any individual of these pass rushers, thinking that guy's going to be, the next 10 plus sack guy. It doesn't really solve the problem as far as your pass rush goes. It's a big step in the right direction, but it doesn't solve the problem. Then you look at the cornerback position, right? You say, okay, well, let's take a cornerback and we'll get a 1-2 punch with, AJ Terrell. Let's go get LSU's Derek Stingley or whatever the case may be. And he's going to be a superstar. And you have 2 elite man cover corners that you can lock down. But you look at the Ravens, they showed you this year, when one of those guys gets hurt, guess what? You're scrapping that defense, right? Right? If you have TJ Green as your backup cornerback, unless you have another elite man corner as your backup on that team, guess what? When you lose one of those guys, and guess what? Derek Stingley has a history of injury, so probably the odds are pretty high, relatively speaking, that he's probably going to get hurt in the NFL. So does that get you excited? And then you lose him for a couple of games, you're scrapping that defense, you're going back to the zone defense, right? And you're back to relying on your front forward to get all the pressure and so much more for, the cornerback. So I say all this not to be negative or doom and gloom or whatever. I'm just trying to explain to you guys why it's hard for me to get excited about one player and one pick. And I don't necessarily hype up this first round pick to be the end all be all. And we're going to do all these mock drafts Mondays, 10 more to do. And I'm like, he's a good player. He's all right. But I'm not going to be that enthusiastic probably about any pick. Now, maybe over the next 10 weeks, we'll start seeing some mocks, so I'll start to be like, okay, this is the guy. But it's just hard for me to get super excited about the Falcons pick. I know you're probably saying like, oh, you just hate the draft. You're just a jaded, bitter old man. And it's like, yes, I am a jaded, bitter old man. I don't hate the draft. The thing that gets me excited about the draft is not really who the Falcons pick. Obviously, I'm eager and interested and do have some level of excitement about who the Falcons wind up taking, but because I don't hype it up to be the end-all, be-all, and this player is going to single-handedly save the franchise in the ways that some of you guys talk about these draft picks, I don't get as excited. The thing that really gets me going when it comes to the draft is when we get there Thursday night and, night one of the draft. It's that break point in the draft. It's the unknown nature of the draft where you don't know what's going to happen. That unpredictability where teams are going to start making these crazy picks or whatever. That break point in the draft, like last year, which quarterback were the 49ers going to take at 3? Who was the Falcons going to take at 4? That got me excited because they didn't know what was going to happen. Those unknowns are the things that I really get excited about, because it's just like, you just don't know what's going to happen, and that's what gets excited about the draft. But the Falcons pick is like, yeah, I hope they get a good player, but it's just one out of a dozen moves that the Falcons are going to have to make over the next couple of years to get this team back on track, and that's part of the reason why it's hard for me to get specifically excited about the Falcons pick. But this year is going to be an interesting draft because, I think that for the first time in a while, we may not necessarily know who the number one pick is going to be. Right now, looking at various mock drafts nowadays, it seems like a lot of people are leaning towards Alabama offensive tackle Evan Neal being that number one pick for the Jaguars. And it does get me excited to be like, oh, we don't even know who the number one pick's going to be. And most years, the last couple of years, we've kind of had a clue on who that number one guy was going to be. But I think, the fact that Evan Neal might be the number one pick in this draft kind of speaks to arguably being a down class. Because if you compare Evan Neal to last year's draft, I don't think Evan Neal would have been a top 10 pick last year, right? He might have gotten drafted ahead of Rashawn Slater, but he probably would have been, valued in that Rashawn Slater, Elijah Vera Tucker tier in sort of in the 13, 14, 15 range of last year's draft. And now he's going to be the number one pick. I don't think he would have been valued over Penny Sewell. And then you compare him to the last Alabama, great offensive tackle. We're not talking about Alex Leatherwood, but you go back to the 2012 draft where Jedrick Wills was a top 10 pick. Is Evan Neal a better prospect than Jedrick Wills? I don't know. I think he has a higher ceiling than Jedrick Wills, but Jedrick Wills certainly had a higher floor than I think Evan Neal does. And so, how does that factor in? And then again, Jedrick Wills was the 10th overall pick, and now Evan Neal is going to be the number one. So again, that kind of speaks to me in my eyes of that this draft class may be a little bit down, that, some of these players that are being picked, in the top 5 this year may not have been top 5 picks, top 10 picks, top 15 picks a year or two ago. So it's just kind of a draft where it's just kind of, you got to get through it, and you just got to hope that you get multiple, good players over the course of this draft. But it's going to be harder for me saying that to get excited about any one individual mock drafts projection for the Falcons at that 8th overall pick. But if you, get excited about the draft, I'm not here to sit here and tell you shouldn't get excited about the draft. I just, come on the podcast and explain why I am not excited about things or why I have the opinion that I have. You are more than welcome to have your own opinion about things. And if you want to get excited about Treylon Burks, you want to get excited about Derek Stingley, then to each his own by all means. But I'm just going to sit here and tell you that when you listen to the mock draft Mondays, you're not going to come away from Aaron being like, yeah, this is a great pick, and this is going to be the guy. This is who I secretly hope the Falcons draft. None of that stuff. We're gonna talk about players. We're gonna talk about how they fit, and of course, we're gonna do that. For 10 more weeks this offseason, and of course, in addition to mock draft Mondays, we'll have an opportunity to do some Monday mailbags. So, of course, you can send in your questions via Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. And, of course, you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. So that's going to do it for us, Guy, on the first mock draft Monday of the offseason. But before we duck out of here, let me plug what your second listen should be after you make Locked On Falcons your first listen. And of course, in addition to Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, and Locked On Hawks, why not check out the Locked On Bets podcast to check out Lee Sterling? We know in football season, betting may be over, but Lee's going to have you covered for his blowout specials, his daily picks, and his lock of the day when it comes to basketball, hockey, UFC, and so much more all off season long. So make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Bets podcast on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. So, guys, that's going to do it for us here on Locked On Falcons. I hope you enjoyed the Super Bowl. I hope you enjoyed this football season. We got so much more offseason to come, and I hope that me not being as excited about the Falcons drafting Treylon Burks will not deter you from future mock draft Mondays. But just giving you a heads up that it's not going to be one of these off seasons where it's like, oh, this is the guy, this is this is everything the Falcons are going to pick, and if they get this guy, all their problems go. I'm definitely not one of those people. So just giving you a heads up for future mock draft Mondays. We can certainly talk about player fits and value and all these various things. But, we're not going to be like, oh, my God, this is the greatest pick in the history of the world. So there you guys have it. Appreciate it. Till then.